Challenges to economic integration. Karim Bardisi is the distinguished visiting professor and special advisor to the president at Ryerson University, currently incubating, building a leadership institute at Ryerson, lots of experience in public policy, as well as politics, journalism, academia. We're so very happy to have him with us today leading this panel. Please join me in welcoming Karim.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the Jusoor committee for putting this together. I heard it was a great morning, and now we're going to get to some really nuts and bolts issues today, which is in the afternoon, which is the economic integration of Syrian refugees. After the really immediate, important early work of refugee, the choice that governments make, the terrible choices that refugees have to make to pick up and go in search of another land. The preservation of the body, the renewal of the heart, comes the building of a life, and that's what we're going to be talking about at this panel here. So I'm happy to welcome on stage now, and I'll just give their names and a bit about them, and then we'll welcome them on stage, and we'll get them talking for about 5 minutes each with their perspectives on their work. So first we've got, and I'll just read them off and tell you a bit about them, and then we'll hear from them. So first, Jim Estill, the CEO of Danby Electronics. I think probably a personal hero to many people in this room, even though he's maybe not, he doesn't know all of you. I think a lot of you know him for his personal, go ahead, yeah. For the personal commitment he made around sponsoring a large number of Syrian refugees in his community. But not only that, I think that's just part of the story, and we'll hear more about that. The rest of the story is how he rallied his company and his community to bring those refugees into the economic life of the community of Guelph and the region. Next, we've got Orlando Farrow from Quinte Immigration Services. Orlando has really been on the front lines of refugee integration issues for decades, and has a really interesting perspective from Belleville and the Bay of Quinte region, which is a more agricultural, rural and small town experience. And the way that region has rallied under his leadership is really a great story that we'll be hearing more about soon. Next, we've got Dana Wagner from Talent Beyond Boundaries. Dana, you may know from her work with Senator Almodvar, is now launching the Canadian launch of a really interesting group called Talent Without Boundaries, or Talent Beyond Boundaries rather, which is really looking to gather that enormous talent pool, that enormous set of assets that refugees have when they come to Canada or other countries, and get that information available as early as possible, so that communities can prepare and bring them into the economic life of their communities faster. And so we'll hear that story from Dana. And finally, we've got Laurie Wilkinson from the University of Manitoba. Laurie arrived here from Winnipeg this morning, is flying out this afternoon, and so we're really lucky to have her. She's been for, again, decades, starting with her PhD thesis on the Yugoslavia refugee crisis, a really important thinker, researcher, and rallier of the community, not just in Winnipeg, but nationwide, around issues of refugee integration, and she's a real expert in that field, and we'll be getting some of the latest research from Laurie on that. So welcome to our panel. And maybe I'll just start. Laurie, I think, has a good slideshow that she wants to show us a few facts from. So maybe we'll start the presentations with Laurie, so we can get a bit of a scene setting on the state of play for refugee integration.
Alrighty, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm going to quickly tell you about two studies, one that I just finished in March that involved only Syrian refugees. I want to let you know that it only involves Syrians who went to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so they've only been in Canada for, the maximum was 2 years, but 70% of the sample less than a year. So I want you to keep that in mind when I speak. The other study is about immigrants and refugees migrating to the western region of Canada as well, as kind of a comparator. So we asked the Syrians and the immigrants in both studies to name their top difficulties. Clearly, this is not a surprise to any of you. It was job and language were the ones most mentioned. So not very surprising in terms of the challenges that they faced. But with the Syrian study, so remember 70% of the sample has only been here less than a year, we asked them if they had difficulty finding work, and clearly most had. But I want to say that the first 9 months, primarily the people we were speaking to were focusing on language training. And in the Prairie region, 97% of the refugees who came had either limited or no knowledge of English at arrival. You can see after month 13 that the difficulties of people mentioning difficulties increased, which is not surprising because this is about the time that they're trying to get on their feet on their own. The next slide shows their current employment status, and it's, there we go. It's not surprising that there's very few people who are employed. The findings from the Syrian study match the findings of other refugees who have come to Canada. So it matches the previous study that we did in the Prairie region. It matches the IRCC statistics on unemployment. And so many of the people indicated that they were unemployed when in fact they were actually focusing on language training. In the larger study about refugees, we asked people about their trouble finding work, finding a job that matches the qualifications that they brought with them. And you can see the, I guess it's the green colored bars are the refugees. We have 47% of refugees in Saskatchewan versus 7% of refugees in Manitoba, indicating that they had trouble finding a job that matched their qualifications. And these findings match other studies as well. The next slide will show you occupational mobility. So this is a crude measure of whether or not your job matches your qualifications currently. And not surprisingly, the refugees between 3 and 4 and 2 and 3 refugees were working at a job for which they were grossly overqualified. That said, the green bars, I want to share some good news with you. 31% of the refugees in Manitoba were actually working at jobs for which they've got training and extra training and skills that they acquired in Canada. So I was asked, what hastens the economic integration of refugees? And the research shows that access to language training quickly will influence job outcomes. For each month that a refugee spends waiting for language training, their unemployment increases by 4 months. And on-the-site job training, on-the-site language training at the job are very proven programs that help refugees integrate. But there's also some non-labor market things that we can do to increase labor market outcomes amongst refugees, namely helping refugees reunite with their families and helping them get citizenship faster. Those two suggestions or programs have been tried in other countries and have actually increased the employment and satisfaction of the refugees in those countries. So I often get asked, well, are refugees suck on the social welfare? And the answer is actually no. So, of course, when we first come to Canada, there's a lot of usage of social assistance amongst refugees. But you can see after year 4 that those numbers start to go down. And the dotted lines, that's the presence of employment income. And what I want to mention about that is that in a lifetime, refugees actually pay more in taxes than they do take out at the beginning, and they also work at higher rates than Canadians do. So the employment rate overall for a lifetime of a refugee is actually higher than it is for people born in Canada. And this is partly what explains it. 59% of refugees come to Canada and other developed nations before their 29th birthday. That means they're probably going to school here anyways. That also means that they're going to have decades of labor market experience by the time they're ready to retire. And one of the points that I'd like to raise is the two green bars are the privately sponsored and government sponsored refugees. They're more likely to get a university education than people born in Canada. And the children of these two groups of people, you can increase that by 50%. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about labor market outcomes for refugees, that, you know, at the beginning, of course, it's going to be hard. Of course, there's going to be challenges and barriers. There's lots of things that we can do, and I think that's part of the discussion point. So I'll maybe leave the policy discussion for question and answer, but to keep in mind that overall, if we look at the labor market histories of immigrants and refugees, they're actually contributing more economically than what we would expect if we just listen to the news and our politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. And maybe to take some of those insights and some of those learnings and bring it to a more local level, we'll now hear from Orlando Farrow and the experience in Belleville Bay of Quinte.
Okay. I would like to first indicate that we are in a smaller community than Toronto. It's a mix of rural, different municipalities, and a big city, which the hub is Belleville. We also, in Quinte West or Trenton, there is a military base that back in 1999, there was a big operation of arrivals from the Kosovo refugees. Those were our first experiences with the refugee, and in 6 months we assisted 6,000 refugees from Kosovo to relocate to Canada to go to the integration process. It was a time record, but that gave us some experience in dealing with the refugees. So when we first start hearing about the possibility that there would be more refugees coming from Syria this time, the outpouring of the community was huge. There was a lot of people willing to help, willing to volunteer, and of course you all know about one photograph in a newspaper that changed the whole empathy of the people. So we started preparing for that. We had the community meetings. We have what we call the local immigration partnership. We are also the only settlement agency in a very big area in Ontario. Through the community meetings, we started trying to organize and have a think tank of how we're going to cope with the crisis. What can we do to make sure that this time is going to be even better than the last time for the integration process, and what type of assistance people would need once they arrive in town. Out of these discussions through the local immigration partnership, we decided to have a forum for all the stakeholders in the region. Those were members of the municipalities, members of the health services, social services, and to do that, we also start providing some presentations on local churches and religious centers, service groups. Everybody wanted to really help and make a difference. We invited an in-man from Ottawa. He was specializing in public speaking, and also he talked about the geography, history, and culture in Syria. That was very useful for members of the community who were not really familiar with the Syrian culture, and that was the beginning of it. Out of that, then we decided to get some more information of the newcomers that we were expecting to arrive. From IRCC, we got one of the main informations that came to my mind particularly was a lot of them had agriculture experience, and we are talking about two distinct types of refugees, as you know, the GARs and the privately sponsored refugees. Privately sponsored refugees coming to our area, they were coming mostly from urban centers in Syria, as opposite to the GARs who were coming from rural areas. So that was one of the first things we had in mind, and why not, since we have so many agricultural land and farms in the area, why not now knowing that there is a labor shortage in this particular sector, let's try and get together with the Syrian refugees who have those skills and explain to them how we would be able to try and integrate them to those to this type of work. So I contacted OMAFRA, which is the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, and try to, instead of reinvent the wheel, see what type of information they would have already available for newcomers or even for potential people interested in agriculture. We got the licenses for those informations, and we did the translation of the booklets and all the information into Arabic. That was a monumental work. Part of our organization also has Central Eastern Ontario Translation Interpretation Services so that we could minimize the costs. Part of the outpouring of donations from the community, and at that point in time we had zero money from government towards this initiative. Everything was done to privately funders, to some of the local organizations, and we created the refugee fund that was supervised by a board of directors, and also at that stage the main focus was to try and provide some sort of information that would be understandable or understood by the newcomers. We also had verified that a lot of them did not have the literacy skills that would be able to read some of those perspective information. So we also tried at the same time to get interpreters into Arabic that would directly approach the newcomers with that information if they could not read. We then organized the first conference for the Arabic-speaking refugees, and in that information session, we had a panel of experts in not from agricultural practices, from different ministries, from how to acquire agricultural landing, types of terms of loan for agriculture, all kinds of information that the people might be interested to know. Lesson learned, because that was a pilot project. When we first had this forum, we had about 147 Syrian refugees in the room. And the first question that came about is that this is very important information to us, but at this point in time, we are extremely worried that in the 13th month, we won't have the support we are having now, and we're going to be on welfare. We don't want to be on welfare. We want jobs now. So this for us was a wake-up call. I said, okay, getting the input from the Syrian refugees was very important to us. We need to provide what they need, not what we think they might need. So that was one of the first steps that we did. So let's change a little bit the pilot project. Let's go towards right now employment. And at that point in time, we did this change. We had a second one, and the second one we got all kinds of employers in spaces a little bit bigger than this one. We had close to 167 refugees from not only from our region but from different regions as well. That was very useful. Exchange was made between the potential employers and employees. Some of them got jobs immediately. Two challenges we had at that point in time. Language was the first one. And the way we thought about solving this, if there was one member of the family who could speak a little bit more of English, we would try with the help of an interpreter to pass the information on to the other members of the family for what tasks would be needing in the farm. The second challenge we had was transportation. It's a rural area. Housing is a problem in Belleville. Belleville has more housing, but we didn't have all the capacity to accommodate them. So we talked to the farmers, and the farmers helped and said, okay, we have this in this location, they can come and stay. So one of them gave them a car so they could come back and forth after renting an apartment in Belleville. Then we start talking to them about cooperative models, how 2 or 3 families could maybe rent a house and divide the tasks into the time things gets better, and then they can move on on their way. They accepted that. That was one of the suggestions that was done, and worked successfully, at least for a couple of families. The other thing that we tried to do was the language situation, how to respond to that. Part of our local immigration partnership is it's one of the schools that provides the ESL, and they talked to some of the farmers, and we created centers where they would go and train the Syrian refugees on ESL on the site. Whenever they would have a time, they would go there and start teaching ESL. So this would facilitate the learning process. We wouldn't want anybody to stay for some time without being able to speak and communicate. Um, well, the pilot project, we got some stats. There's going to be some publication of those stats very soon. And it ended up, this was, by the way, this project was funded through the Canadian Red Cross. We had then a request from other parts of the province to, at that point in time, put a small information session on agriculture. Agriculture started to spend for food processing, food handling. I think 11 people in our region, mostly the ladies from the families, they they got the certification and training through the local health unity to food handling, and they are very successful now in catering services. There is one restaurant, at least one family opened a restaurant in Belleville, halal, which we didn't have before, and in conjunction with the local imam and all the organizations that did around, it's a working restaurant. Actually, it's a good one. So that's our brief story. I think my 5 minutes is over.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Orlando, and some lessons there about how important it is to have a community prepare for arrival, and the partnerships that are required, and also the dialogue, not just within the community but around different communities. And now turn over to Dana to talk about Talent Beyond Boundaries.
Yeah, so thank you so much to Jusoor and the other panelists for having this discussion today. And Laurie, that was really fantastic to have that overview of your research. So thank you for that. So my name is Dana Wagner. I work with Talent Beyond Boundaries. And I'll just provide a little overview of what we do, just a few of the challenges and how we're going about overcoming those. So Talent Beyond Boundaries was founded in 2015 to essentially open up different options for refugees to move abroad. So the idea is not to replace existing pathways for refugees, existing humanitarian or resettlement streams, but it's really to open up labor mobility, so skilled migration. And we're essentially trying to prove that this route is a viable route for refugees. So in the same way that it makes sense for a country like Canada to attract skilled immigrants, we should also be attracting skilled refugees because it makes economic sense for employers and for countries as well. So how do we do this? We're currently working in 2 pilot countries, in Jordan and Lebanon. And in these countries, over 10,000 candidates have signed up onto a skills database we call the Talent Catalog. And the refugees that we're working with in these countries are extremely highly skilled, and it's really like people sign up onto this database independently, and what we do next is connect candidates to employers in destination countries like Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and others. So once people are hired, they will actually be moving as skilled immigrants to these countries, so not as refugees through UN resettlement. And I just want to stress that this is really in a pilot phase right now, so nobody has actually immigrated via one of these routes, so we're still just in proof of concept, essentially. So a few of the challenges that we're kind of working to overcome. A big one is the lack of information that employers globally have about refugee talent. And really what employers need is detailed, what we've been hearing is they really do need detailed information about what is basically a hidden talent pool. Otherwise, you wouldn't know how to access, you wouldn't know how to hire. It's just basically like a blank spot, in recruitment strategies. And so our contribution to filling this data gap is really ongoing analytics of this group of 10,000 that we have. And among those registered with TBB, just to give you a snapshot, about a third speak English, about a third have tertiary education, and among the college educated, about half have STEM degrees. And this is really valuable information when we're talking to employers, to be able to actually get a granular picture and to go in and say, oh, you need a software developer, let's shortlist this for you, and actually match employers directly to talented people. Another barrier, I should have said, I'm going to talk about two, but there are, like, I could go on and on. But the second kind of major one is that there are barriers built into our immigration systems that unintentionally, but nonetheless do exclude refugees. So in Canada currently, if you're a refugee living abroad somewhere, just due to status and circumstance, you actually are not able to, your application just either won't even be able to be registered, or it's not going to be a successful application to immigrate to Canada as a skilled refugee. So to overcome this, we're working very closely with governments in the countries we're working with, very closely with the UNHCR. But to give you an example, in Canada, the federal government, there's actually been a working group struck within the immigration department whose explicit aim is to facilitate this pilot. So we've had a really wonderful response from the Canadian government in terms of actually being willing to work on this and really wanting to make it work for people to access. So a few achievements just so far. Again, nobody has actually immigrated through this pathway, but we've had some exciting early wins just with employers. So there's a financial tech company in Australia that has offered a contract to a software engineer. In Canada, we have a roofing company that's based in BC that has offered a job, a hard contract we finally got last weekend, to a roofer based in Lebanon. And third, we are working with a software company here in Toronto that is right now in the process of screening 3 of our candidates for a software developer role. And just to really drive home the talent that these candidates obviously have, it won't be a surprise to anyone in this room. But this software company that we're working with here in Toronto, one of the early steps that they have in the recruitment process for this particular role is an online technical test. So it's a coding scenario. And they warned us that this is very difficult, that it's a pretty low pass rate for people who they bring in to take it. And so it's a 20% pass rate. And so the 3 candidates that we put forward to take this test, that were invited to take it, all passed. So we had a 100% pass rate. And those candidates are actually moving on to a technical interview that'll be happening this week. So I'll end here and just emphasize again that the vision of what we're doing at Talent Beyond Boundaries, and with all of the partners who we work with, including Jusoor in Lebanon and Jordan, is to really increase the options available to refugees. So what we're trying to do is include refugees into immigration systems and make sure they have equal access to skilled immigration streams and the same ability to make economic contributions really as anyone else, anyone in this room and any of us in Canada could also do.
Great, thank you so much. So 2 really innovative approaches, one approach locally and one approach internationally that's being brought to Canada. We'll now hear from Jim and tell us a bit about his story, how he got involved in this work.
So this is about economic integration. So I'm mostly going to limit it to that because we have 5 minutes. I brought in 58 refugee families, and I really loved Lori's statistics, but they were really eye-opening to me. Of my 58 families, 49 of them are working at levels that they can support themselves. So that's what we have. And I would say we're probably going to get another 4 or 5 of them into that as well, because some of them have only been here for a couple of months, so it takes a little while. When I first was sponsoring, I said I was not going to hire any of them in my factories. And the reason is I didn't want to be accused of bringing in slave labor. And so then what I did is I brought people in and I would refer them to my friends. And I found that the people coming in weren't quite job ready yet. And often the people I'd refer them to didn't quite have the system set up to accommodate them. So I then changed my mind, and I now offer 90-day employment to any refugee. So I've had over 200 refugees in for my 90-day program, which is, we call it Ease Into Canada. And the primary purpose of the Ease Into Canada program is to learn English. And that ties into, again, Lori's slides. What's the issues? It's learning English. I don't believe that learning English in a classroom is the only way to go. Now, our Ease into Canada program, we do ESL class. We do English lunch buddies. We do English word of the day. We have an English coach assigned for each person to say, okay, I want you to do 20 minutes of Duolingo, and I want you to watch an hour of English television, and I want you to read these 3 pages, and I want you to, here's your Skype tutor, and here's your T-circles, and here's your walk and talk buddy. And then the coach, just like your personal trainer, checks in on Monday. Did you watch your hour of television? What did you watch, and whatnot? Also, by calling it that the purpose of the program is to learn English, it helps my management, my supervisors to understand this isn't about productivity. We're not trying to put through another 10,000 freezers. It's to learn English. So it helps on the management side, and it also helps a lot on the class system issue that we have with Syrians. People from Syria can be somewhat classist and say, wait a minute, I'm a lawyer. I wear a suit to work. I couldn't work in a factory because that's not who I am. But you say the purpose is to learn English. Come work in the factory. And the jobs are also very light and very easy, so anyone can do them, male or female. And then during that program, we do resume writing, and we do interview coaching to find out where the person should be placed. And then what we do is we make calls to businesses where they should be placed and say to the employer, would you give this person a chance for 90 days? So an example would be, I had one woman come in, she's an architect. Worked for 90 days in the Ease into Canada program. We actually moved her into our CAD department for another 90 days or so after that, which we don't design houses, but we do design refrigerators and stuff like that. So she now is using tools in Canada, has on her resume a little bit of CAD, and then I called an architecture firm and said, would you hire this woman? Do me a favor, hire her for 90 days. And right now I probably get 60 or 70% say yes, and they hire them for 90 days, and you know what happens? Usually they keep them. If not, they are able to move into another role. The other statistic Lori had is the underemployment. Now, the sad fact of our world today is, I don't know the stats, but there's probably 20% of the population, or maybe 25%, that is underemployed. And I know that because my friends say, can you talk to my son or daughter and tell them, they just graduated and what should they be doing and whatnot. There is a lack of white-collar jobs. There is no lack of blue-collar jobs. So of the group I would have about half of them would be working what I'll say below their capability. The other half are well-suited, but they'll ease into it. The other, like Lori's stats were great. Like some of them, you really have to look at their bullet points. You need to make some of the bullets bigger. Like one of the success points is getting people working sooner. If people are working, it's easier to work and move from a job to a job than to say, well, I'm just used to sitting at home all day. And even an employer, I am an employer. I've hired thousands of people. You look at a resume and you say, you're working. Well, that means you're a hard worker. I'll hire you. Oh, what? You didn't work for 6 months? Like, what's wrong with you? Another success story. We had an engineer. He's an electrical engineer. Within 2 weeks of arriving in Canada, he started working as a machine operator at Linamar Machines, which is a very large company in Guelph. Swing shift. 2 weeks days, 2 weeks evenings, 2 weeks nights. He did that for 6 months. And during that time, we're kind of networking. Who do we know can do it? We introduced him to Aramasa Engineering. Same deal. Give him a chance, 90 days. Now he's permanent there, working as an engineer, getting paid as an engineer with the career. The underemployed people that we have also tend to really not be underemployed, just as there is no job that is like what they did. So some of the people came in, they worked in an NGO. Oh, that's great. Well, we don't have any NGOs that pay any money. They're a petroleum engineer. I get it. You're a petroleum engineer. This is Guelph. There is no jobs in petroleum. So basically, I think that's what I did, and let's turn it back to the.
Thank you so much, Jim. One of the lessons that I think we're getting across this panel is we can have these policy ideas or these frameworks, but then we actually have to find out how they're adapting on the ground, and some really good lessons in each case about how folks are reacting to the facts on the ground. I want to just pick up on one question. I'm gonna get a couple questions, and if you think you have a question in the audience, we'll be doing audience questions soon. So get ready to get your hands up for that as well, and we'll have volunteers with mics coming around. This lot of interesting facts about the economic situation. Can maybe each of you talk a bit about some of the health and well-being preconditions that maybe are required to be successful economically, and what you're seeing in your experiences in terms of people's readiness to work from a health perspective, a mental health perspective, given some of the experiences they may have had before arriving in Canada.
So I mean, we've been very fortunate. Because we brought in 58 families, we had arranged in advance one Arabic-speaking psychologist to deal with psychological issues, and we've had to use it for 3 people. But people actually get healthier if they're allowed to work. I actually believe in the value of work from a social interaction point of view. I believe that, and I definitely believe in it for a way to learn English. It's self-esteem. There's everything good about it. I mean, I hate to say it, if you said to me, you sit at home all day, I'd probably need psychological help. I mean, from a health point of view, they have a lot of dentist needs, and I know what the issue is. There's too much sugar in the tea. I know that. There's a disproportionate number of Syrians that come in that smoke, and a lot of this is business stuff. Part of that is straight economics. Cigarettes are cheaper in Syria than they are here, and so I always say to them, in Canada, it's unhealthy to smoke. So we've had to put a lot of them on the patch and get them weaned. But there's still a higher percentage than general population.
Anyone else want to take on that issue and react to?
Sure. Yeah, basically just echo that. And I think we're kind of working with the other perception that refugees aren't yet ready to work, or that they need time. And I think it's going to be individual, and really you just have to, I think the point was made earlier, just that you really have to listen and hear from refugees themselves when it's right for them and what they're thinking. So in the case of our project, it's a little bit easier in that our field teams in Jordan and Lebanon, when they're talking to people, it's people who are have to kind of self-select and say, yes, I want to work, yes, I want to move for this, yes. And in many cases they're already doing whatever they can locally. And just an interesting just angle of this too is, when we talk about work, or this is maybe just a broader lesson here, but typically the opposite of work is not sitting at home. And we've learned really this from candidates who we're working with too. And when we look at a CV and then we actually invite somebody in to speak to them and say, okay, just maybe tell us about an exciting thing that you've been doing. It looks like you've been in Jordan for a little while and you haven't been working. And then all of a sudden you get stories about oh, well, I'm doing this work for this company, but it's on a pro bono basis. I'm developing my own app right now and all this stuff. And it's list all of this. This is you're working, you're doing things. So really it's just, people, when they're ready, and I think more often than not they are.
What are the economic aspirations for refugees? And we're going to have a variety, right? There's probably some who are going to want to be entrepreneurial right away. Some who just want to rebuild their standard of life that they had, or have a standard of life that they're comfortable for their children. Any experiences or any sense of that you can gather so far?
We had about 62 families sponsored in our region. As I mentioned before, it's a very large region. To respond to the first question, I would say maybe 3 or 4 families had serious health issues, and those issues were not only psychological but also health issues that took a long-term care. We already knew, the groups already knew. We had a very good interaction with all the sponsoring groups in our region. We had meetings with them. We tried to plan for the existing services we had, and the assistance was there for them. In terms of aspirations for economical integration, A lot of them, once we had the second, I would call it a job fair, employers start interviewing them through the help with interpreters, and we found out that not only agriculture skills they had, but they also had skills in construction. Some of them were bricklayers. Some of them had worked as mechanics, and none of that had originally been disclosed was in the portfolio that we received from those newcomers. So knowing that a lot of the municipalities were also present there, we decided to extend the forms that they were filling in Arabic and putting additional comments on that. And the economic development officers, who is they are the liaison with the employers in the area, they start distribution of this additional information. Okay, now we know that we have a little bit more than agriculture here. So if agriculture is not the main purpose, they also have other options. So this was one of the things that happened as well.
I think young people, if we keep in mind, right, that 59% of all refugees migrate before their 29th birthday, they're young people. And the research shows that if you compare refugee youth to immigrant youth to youth born in Canada, they have the highest aspirations. But they're amongst the most successful, actually. So they're overrepresented amongst class valedictorians, and as I mentioned earlier, are more likely to complete a university degree. So I think that if it's amazing to me that having gone through the things that many people have gone through, the aspirations haven't been killed, really.
We talked about maybe having a bit of a policy discussion. So some really good facts about what you've been doing locally or through your organizations. If you had one policy recommendation to make to a level of government, and choose one, and then one call out to not a level of government but to the community at large to help with the economic integration of refugees. So one to government and one to the community. What would that be?
Let me start. I guess my one to the government would be to reintroduce this lovely matching program that they used to have years ago, where the federal government would provide financial assistance to encourage employers to hire refugees. That worked very well, and it was canceled. In Canada and the United States, who've also used these programs, the people who've benefited from the programs, about 3/4 of them actually find permanent jobs with these employers anyways, and they kind of work like the Danby electronics example. If you just give the employer a little bit of financial assistance to hire somebody, they tend to keep them on. So that would be my suggestion to government, is reintroduce that program. I think to communities to ask of their governments to support refugees, especially with language training programs. In some of the provinces, the upper language training programs like CLB 5 and higher are no longer offered or harder to get because of cuts to language programs. So if you're a professionally trained person and you don't have CLB 8, you're going to have a hard time getting a job with the language that you have.
What is CLB 8? What would that level would
That
be
would
like?
be the minimum that you would need to get into university.
So,
Canadian language benchmark, sorry.
so I don't believe in government intervention that much, because I'm kind of a capitalist. But at the end of the day, if they're going to have a policy, I love Laurie's policy, and the only thing I would add to it, or possibly a different program, is it would be good to have support of ESL in the workplace, because that is what people ultimately need to be successful. And I have other employers, I get them to try to implement the Ease into Canada program, with their ESL, but then you're asking people to take, time off at their work day to go into ESL class. They need instructors, all this kind of stuff. That does seem like a reasonable investment for the government to make.
And a call out to the community?
I'm sorry?
And do you have a further call out to the community in Guelph that you want them to be doing more on?
the Guelph community has been outstanding, and this program has really drawn Guelph together. And I really can't say enough about how good the community support has been. And I don't think there's anything, except I guess to any employer who's turned me down, like, just give someone a chance, because they will work and they will do well.
Quick word on the government policies. One of the recommendations I would make is a better, planning and distribution of existing resources. I know that the conversation has been going on with the High Commissioner of Refugees in the United Nations for a long time, with the government of Canada. One of the things that could have been done in the 4 years that some of the refugees were at the camps was starting ESL before they move, and I'm not even say to Canada, but moving to Australia, moving to any other country. English is, may we want or not, the international language. And I think it's very important that those refugee camps, they start ESL right there. So this will be a massive advancement for them when they arrive in Canada and be job ready.
Yeah, so just on the broader immigration level, in terms of being able to bring in more refugees, but as skills or folks with job opportunities, there are lots of technical changes, which I won't get into. But at a broader levels planning side, Canada's immigration policy right now, currently, we invite in roughly 300,000 immigrants a year, and just over 50% of those, maybe 56%, 170,000 people come in through the economic stream, and then we've got 40,000 refugees. And so just a policy recommendation for government, what we're trying to do with bringing folks in this way, is really to keep it within that economic stream. So we don't want to kind of blur the lines here and have other refugees who are coming in for other purposes, be brought in through resettlement. We want to make sure we retain that 40,000 and really kind of be a piece of this economic stream. And it's not necessary that this has to happen, but I would really like to see our government develop something like a refugee talent stream within our current economic figures. And then a call out to the community. I think just for employers, I would also really like to see something around, so for employers to actually proactively build into their talent acquisition and recruitment strategies a targeted focus on protected persons or refugees or whatever the kind of inclusive terminology for this would be, because we see from Jim what we're doing at Talent Beyond Boundaries, what I know others like Mustafa at RCJP is doing, is a lot of legwork and a lot of personal asks to companies. So how do we embed this, and how do we make it really long-lasting and sustainable? And I think it really has to be a built-in target. Otherwise, it won't be met, and it won't be, when we don't have Jim and Danby doing this kind of legwork in Guelph, is it going to be sustainable?
Any questions? Want to get some questions from the audience going? So, see some hands going up, and your volunteer is just behind you, and the volunteer will hold the mic so that you can focus on asking a short question. The volunteers will hold the mic.
It's Mustafa from RCJP, Jumpstart. Actually, I have a question for Jim. We've been trying so hard. I've been trying so hard. Reach out to companies and business owners to do on-site English training while they're doing the work. And that's a great idea. We've been trying to do this for the longest time ever. I'm not getting any response. It's just because of that. But now when you mentioned the ease into Canada, which is the one you're doing, how possible is it to get some numbers out of that program and publish it? Just trying to advocate on those numbers, send it to other employers and see what are the success rate out of them. And maybe that would be a way, because it could be as a pilot that we could use, data that we could use to convince other employers in that way. Is that possible?
Sure. I mean, I could get the real numbers. To the best of my knowledge, we put through about 200 people through our Ease into Canada, and one of them is not working now. So they go through our program, and they get placed in other jobs. And I know of one of them that's not working. There might be someone else, but the problem is that you're asking an employer to do it, and unless the employer's, you're not solving what the employer's interest is necessarily. So although that's a pretty good stat, 1 out of 200 isn't working, it's good for the government, but it's not necessarily good for the business owner. The problem the business owner has is, they're looking at it basically black and white. How much did they make or lose while they had that person doing ESL? Our ESL, we do half on company time and half on the refugees' time. So we ask people to put some of their own. Our ESL instructors are volunteers, so most of them are retired teachers. and whatnot. And I think that the coaching is more important than the classroom. Like it's getting people to know that you got to have your I don't believe in television. I don't even own a television. I think it's a big North American time waster. But I believe if you're going to learn English, it's a good tool. And so when I go to visit people, I want to see the television on in English. I don't want to see it on in Arabic.
Hi, my question is to Professor Wilkinson. It's threefold. A, why did you exclude the two major provinces, Ontario and Quebec, in your data set? B, how are Syrian refugees doing if you were to contrast them versus other refugees coming into Canada? C, how are Syrian refugees doing with respect to Syrian immigrants economically and
Okay,
other?
so I could only do the prairie provinces because IRCC only gave me money to do the prairie provinces. So you got to take that up with IRCC. I also only had 13 days to collect the Syrian data, and we interviewed 631 families in 13 days. So, well, not we, well, a lot of us did. I am in talks with IRCC to continue doing this research with more Syrians from across Canada, but also other refugees too. So your second question was, how are Syrians doing versus other refugees? I can see the patterns are fairly similar. I think the big difference is not whether you're Syrian, but if you're coming as a privately sponsored versus a government-sponsored refugee, because the privately sponsored refugees tend to find work faster. So 52% of privately sponsored refugees find work by the end of their first year. Most of it's not great work, but it's transitional work into better jobs. The GARs take a little longer, but for them it's probably 3 years before they start matching the PSRs. How are the Syrian refugees doing versus the Syrian immigrants? I actually can't answer that question. And the reason is that a lot of, I do some secondary data too, and a lot of that data is suppressed because the numbers are small for Syrian immigrants. So I am part of a government group that's looking at that, and we might be able to answer that question very soon. Thank you.
Orlando has a.
I have a suggestion. If you want to Google MPI, Migration Policy Institute, they have a study recently. I think it was through the University of Saskatchewan. It was part of it, and yours as well. And they have other comparables that includes the rest of Atlantic and Ontario as well.
Okay. There and then here.
Hi, my name is Drakshan from Welcome Home TO, and my question is directed to anyone who wants to answer it. But we talk a lot about the economically productive, immigrant or refugee, and I think it's super important to highlight how if you give someone a chance, they can work and they will succeed. I just wanted to speak to or ask about the situations where, in I guess my work with refugees, I've noticed that there are sometimes we have to take into account the reality of some refugees where no matter how much they want to be that economically productive immigrant and refugee, that's like the model we're trying to support. Sometimes it's very difficult because of maybe mental health reasons, trauma. Some people, I have been talking to refugees in Germany who are trying, but they just can't learn the German language, and it's just really overwhelming for them. And it's just no matter how much. Perhaps it's undiagnosed learning disabilities, perhaps it's trauma or whatever it is, but there are significant barriers that I feel like sometimes we can overlook. And some people will be in the country for 20 years and maybe not learn English that time. How do we tailor these solutions to particularly especially from vulnerable populations where oftentimes if someone hasn't had access to education in their home country because of poverty or whatever, it's very difficult to learn at 40 a new language, if you've never been offered opportunity to work in your own country because of your gender, same thing. How do we tailor these suggestions, and how do we address these like vulnerable populations that can get overlooked in this dialogue?
Lori, do you want to?
That's a very good question and a very valid question too, because a lot of people who come have never been given the chance to be educated or have had to leave school for, I'm not talking about months, but years. And so for that group of people, some of them will struggle a lot with learning English. And so educators will tell you that actually for some of them, getting them fluent in their own language, because many of them are functionally illiterate in their own language, focusing on that first and then getting them into English tends to be successful. But also taking some of the pressure off of people too. I think there's a lot of pressure by Canadians and governments to get everybody up and working, not realizing that things happen to people and it takes time to overcome these kinds of things too. So and even simple government things that they can do to fund daycare for women to go to school, but appropriate daycare is also an issue I see.
So I have a slightly counter view on some of it, and that is, I believe it's a privilege to work, and I believe people are healthier working. And I don't like the trend where people, oh, they're not ready to work yet. And so one of the ways I help people work is we will put 5 people into a company. 1 person that speaks English well, 4 people that are learning. And so that way you have sort of a little bit of Arabic supervision, and you have, I'm not going to call it peer pressure, but peer pressure. People say, oh, well, look, here's another woman who works at the next place doing the same thing, so that means I'm a woman, I can work, and it sort of sets people up to that. Now, the other thing that is difficult, and this goes back to policy, I like having some easy work. The problem we have is many of the jobs that people have, they're actually very tough jobs. Like working on a machine, that's fairly tough, really, heads down, productivity, you have to turn out 1,000 parts an hour, stuff like that. Even the fast retail jobs, Tim Hortons, McDonald's, those are tough jobs for someone who doesn't speak English perfectly. So it's unfortunate, this is an Ontario government policy, that there's a policy they won't let you do those easier jobs. So I actually loved the parking lot attendant job that we have, which of course goes away because minimum wage goes up. And I loved being able to put them in a light production environment where, okay, you only need to do 20 an hour, and the others are doing 40 an hour, but we're just sort of working you through gently.
Just to add to that, I love that approach. I think it's brilliant of just like having a bit of a community develop within the workplace. Just quickly, another policy that Lori referenced earlier was just we know this through research and evidence that actually having your family with you in the really broadly defined sense of family makes a huge difference. And Rasha from University of Toronto in a workshop earlier made some really good points just about how certainly not for everyone, but for a few people with particular experiences, the trauma of what they've experienced can just be so intense that learning a language is just it's not possible for you, and you just won't do it. So to the questioner's point, and I think that's a type of policy where, if your family is still in danger abroad. And so I do think at a policy level, there's really an imperative to actually include like some blend of a humanitarian and family reunification program, which we don't currently have, but I think it's a double imperative, and I think it's very important.
And adding to that, extended families deal with the childcare. I mean, that's just the nature of the culture, and it's not bad at all.
Hi, my name's Anna Roach, and I actually had a question also for Jim still. Going off of Mustafa's question earlier is, so we know that ESL training can be really expensive, especially if we're putting the amount of work and the amount of like tailoring into it that people really need to have that work well, especially in like a work environment. And that can also lead to lessened productivity, because if you don't speak excellent English, you may not understand the directions immediately, etc., etc. So how do you, we obviously all understand the humanitarian benefits of a program like that, but how do you package it so that it is something that a corporation or a company has incentive to do, as opposed to just this is something that would do good for your community?
Well, if you really want to make it economic, then you could add some sort of government incentive to do it. But many people aren't good classroom learners, so it's not, I don't believe, completely in just the ESL. So we have Arabic-speaking supervisors say, in English, today we're going to work on freezers, and then say it in Arabic, today we're going to work on freezers, and then say, repeat after me, today we're going to work on freezers. And what's the English word of the day? This. Oh, do you already forget the English word of the day? What was it yesterday? So they're sort of working through it while they're working, which is a much less, it's not as intimidating, especially if someone's not well educated. If someone is a scholar and is educated and used to sitting in a classroom, then sitting in a classroom learning English does work for them, but it doesn't work for everybody in all circumstances. And it's also having, like, eat lunch with someone who speaks English. Don't eat lunch with a bunch of Arabics sitting at one table and a bunch of English speaking at the other table. It's the easy stuff.
Just want to jump on something. I think that the biggest incentive for employers right now is labor shortages. I don't know if you're facing the same thing that we are in Guelph, but I'll give you an example. In Belleville, we had a job fair, 900 positions available, 400 people showed up, and half of them, they would not qualify for the existing positions. There is a massive labor shortage in Canada, even identified through the Canada board. So I think that's a big incentive.
I agree.
Hi, my name is Rama Shakaki, and I'm a board member in the Syrian International Business Association. On behalf of the businessmen and women of Syria, I thank you for all the work that you're doing collectively, and then also ask, what can we do as an international business community or the local representation in Canada to support your efforts, and how can we collaborate?
With your association, I'm pretty sure you have contacts overseas. I think trade is one of the main aspects of any diasporas in the world. They have their networks. They sometimes are importer exporters of goods, and that could be a big beginning.
Are we seeing from the? Can you tell us a couple entrepreneurships? You told us about the restaurant. Any other entrepreneurship stories, either in the Bay of Quinte region or in the Guelph area, or others that you're aware of that we should be really celebrating?
Apart from the entrepreneurships, at this point in time, we can attest one thing: the younger generation, they are doing very well. I was amazed that in a few months, the kids are already fluent in English, and they were sitting down when they volunteered to some of the events we put together, and they were helping. I couldn't believe it, because they were like just with the other children, the Canadian children, and they were very, very fluent. I think this is the biggest success. This is the main thing that we can see, that as young as they come, like in the past, I remember, I don't remember because I might be old, but not that old, maybe 60, 70 years ago, there was no ESL in Canada. People would just come from Holland and for agriculture, and they had to learn the language, and they did. And the youngest generation were the closest one to really embrace it and go faster than the parents. So,
So from entrepreneurs, we have one family that opened a sock store, so they're basically selling socks, and that one's going well. We have one that group that does commercial pizza. What I mean by that is, order when a business wants to order 20 or 30 or 50 pizzas for lunch. It's not that you call up and order one pepperoni pizza for dinner. You order 30 and 40. And we have a tailor that does alterations. So those are three businesses that have started. Now, I am an entrepreneur, and I've started a lot of businesses, funded a lot of businesses, and generally speaking, very business oriented. I actually encourage people to work for a while first, because I found it to be a struggle to get the cultural nuances. Like, the sock store opens in the sock mall, and my friend that owns the mall calls me and says, it's 10:30 in the morning, they're not open. And they say, well, nobody ever buys anything from 10 to 11, so we just wander in whenever we feel like. But you read the lease, you have to be open when the store is open. And I went in, they're putting signs on all the socks, $5 a pair. I said, that seems a little expensive for these socks. And they said, well, they can talk us down to $2. Well,
In Winnipeg, a former refugee has started up a work program called hirearefugee.ca. It was started to help people who are in the construction, home building, renovations industry get some Canadian experience. And that part of the business is still going, but now they're doing other things like branching out to try to help other refugees get work in the areas for which they're trained in. This the business itself is going well. If you go on their Facebook page, though, it's not so. People leave racist stuff all over their Facebook page.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
So, which is unfortunate.
So, one other successful refugee story in Guelph, the largest employer was started by a refugee. He has 25,000 employees.
Linamar?
That Linamar, he was a Hungarian refugee. When he came to Canada, he lived in the train station or the bus station in Montreal for 2 weeks. He then made his way to Guelph, lived on a farm, and worked at Danby Appliances. That's how he started. And then we were making some parts. They were buying some, and he said, "Well, how much do you pay for that?" I said, $10. Well, if I provided them freight, could you do that? Buys a lathe, puts it in his garage, and it takes a long time to grow a business. But that was a very successful refugee story.
Another thing that I think is very important is, information is gold, and just to provide recent arrived refugees with a business plan, how it works in Canada, it's very important. A lot of them, they know how to handle or have a business. Back in Syria, it's pretty different. Here there are rules, regulations, government information that is needed. So at this point in time, we're trying to put this type of information together, translate into Arabic, and be part of the information sessions we're going to be providing throughout the province.
Do you have time for one more question?
Jim Shankman from Helping Newcomers Work. Could you comment on the participation of women in the families working, whether it be among your factories or going through that program, or in general, and the cultural expectations in dealing with those?
So my experience is culturally, the women are less likely to work than Canadian women. But when they come, they will work. But there's also a little bit of this classist thing. It does depend on how higher class the female is in the family. But there's still a little bit of a gender issue. And some of the women won't do certain jobs. Like they say, no, I can't work in, they have a whole list of things they can't do, where the men can be more flexible and can do more things.
There's an economic theory called the family investment hypothesis. And actually it says, amongst newly arrived refugee families, the women are the first to work because they invest in having their husbands learn English or get a skill set first, and they are the ones who are putting the food on the table. So I think it's hard to talk about women in general, because I think there's a lot of differences around cultural groups and also personal situations too.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the panel for a really, really great discussion. I want to have the audience thank all of you.